Verse 15 of Exodus 20. Very short verse. You shall not steal. Not very long verse, not very profound, not very hard to understand, and yet it is a profound statement. You shall not steal. It defines a lot, if you'll think about it. And I believe that God intended for them to stop and think about what that implies. We have world systems today, right now, that do not understand what that means. We have humanistic governments which are quasi-religions. Or maybe they're quasi-governments. I'm not sure which they are. But the idea of private property and private individual ownership of property is thought about as something that is not legitimate and should not be considered as legitimate. God declares here that He said, you shall not steal. That implies that it is wrong for you to take something that belongs to somebody else. Now, by definition, that means that somebody else owns something that you do not own.
And legitimately so.
Legitimately so. Is that not profound? Apparently so today. Now, we teach our children this, do we not? When they're very small. And they don't like it very much. When you have two children and they can't even talk yet, and one of them takes a toy away from the other one, and you tell the child to give the toy back. You say, that's not your toy, it belongs to your brother. And you make them give it back, and they cry. They try to take it by force, and you spank their hand, and they cry. What are you teaching them?
Not to steal.
Not to steal. You're teaching them the idea of personal ownership, private property. Now, in the book of Exodus, we do have further laws that do define private property rights. In chapter 21, we have a number of laws that define obligations. In a civil law setting, we also have a chapter in the book of Leviticus speaking of our obligation before God. I say the obligation of Israel before God to not profane your neighbor before God by disrespecting your neighbor. And the idea of not respecting your neighbor's rights is regarded as a kind of deception. And you think about that, because lying and deception and thievery are concepts that overlap. These are moral concepts. All of these laws are, if you'll think about it, murder is a kind of theft, is it not? What are you stealing when you murder someone? You're stealing their life. Your life is one of your most precious possessions. So you're stealing your life. That's why a thief, in many cases, does not hesitate to steal the life of the one that they're robbing. If you're willing to steal, let's say, a gold watch from someone, and they do not want to give you their gold watch, they might be willing to kill you to take the watch, because they don't value your life any more than they value the gold watch. They don't care that you shall lose not only your watch, but also your life. And so they will take it. How about adultery? Are you not stealing something there? What might you be stealing with adultery? Go ahead.
A person's virginity.
Okay, you might be stealing a person's virginity, or not usually virginity with an adultery would be a married woman. What would it be?
That's her spouse.
Okay, somebody's wife. You're stealing somebody's wife, okay? You are stealing somebody's honor, a man's wife, or honor. You are, okay? With how about well, you use a lie in order to steal or to defraud. There you have again, and we'll see that in the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. The tying together of lying and thievery, and also the idea of trust and faith and adultery. Notice how those things kind of tie together. When you have adultery, you have a break of trust. Okay? Because with adultery, you have the break of a covenant or of a promise or the breaking of a trust before God and between two individuals. And what happens there is you have deception, you have fraud, and you have theft. So in these commandments, one after the other, you have an interrelationship of different moral principles. One piles on top of the other. And so as we read these things together, and we get into other chapters in the writings of God through Moses, you will notice they kind of overlap. Let me show you. Before I do that, that was not how I was going to introduce this tonight. Let me back up a little bit and give you my introduction for this tonight. Let me take you to Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4. I wanted to give you an introduction from the prophet Habakkuk. Now, if I was, if I was doing this with my tape recorder, I could just hit stop and go back, rewind, and start over again. Habakkuk 2 and 4 is the verse that's quoted in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. And after verse 16 talks about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God and salvation. And then in verse 17, we're told that the righteousness of God is revealed from faith into faith. And then it says, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. That comes from verse 4. Now he says, you remember in the context of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is grieving over God using Babylon to invade and punish unrighteous Judah, because Judah was the wicked element in Judah was oppressing the oppressing the righteous. And so Habakkuk is saying, "O Lord, how long I cry," verse 1, verse 2, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear?" Okay, chapter 2, the Lord is telling Habakkuk, I'm going to send, chapter 1, the end of chapter 1, the Chaldeans. Okay. And Habakkuk did not like that answer. This, in chapter 2 and verse 4, the Lord introduces to Habakkuk the idea of faith. That is, God will take care of His faithful, those who are true to Him, those who are loyal to Him. The righteous shall live by his faith, he says. Now, after he says that, right away, he explains how he will bring about justice against those who are unjust and unfaithful. And so, right away in verse 5, he says, moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him with scoffing and riddles for him and say, okay, and beginning here in verse 6, there are 4 different declarations as to the things that God, standards by which God, woes by which God would condemn ravenous nations for their crimes against humanity. And number 1 in verse 6, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly rise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoiled for them, because you've plundered many nations. All the remnant of the people shall plunder you for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You devise shame for your house. By cutting off many peoples, you have forfeited your life. For the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city with iniquity. All of this to describe the man who does what? He heaps up what is not his own. He builds his house by plundering others. He takes what does not belong to him. Nations who build their nest on high, they do that by stealing from other nations. That's the idea. This is what tyrants do. Tyrannical nations, tyrannical kings. They rob and they plunder. And when they do that, what happens? People resist. And so when they resist, what happens? War. Bloodshed. Just like when you're trying to steal from somebody, they're going to resist. And so if they resist, you kill them. Or maybe they have a gun and maybe they kill you. Or maybe they won't. But the idea of stealing is a bloody scene, one way or another, in so many contexts. Now, last summer at about this time, we had riots going on. You remember that? And it was supposedly because of some injustices that many young men thought, and women, thought had happened in various different cities. And so, as they rioted, they went into certain cities and they would break the glass in various stores, and they would rob and pillage. They would steal merchandise and happily steal. Why would they do that? Why would they take what did not belong to them?
It was easy for them one time.
It was easy, okay.
That's not all. It's a part of it.
What were they lacking? What was it they were not thinking?
Consequences.
Well, it's multifaceted. They had no respect for God.
Okay, no respect for God.
No respect for their fellow man.
No respect for the fellow man.
No fear of consequences.
Sense of entitlement.
I'm sorry?
A sense of entitlement.
A sense of entitlement, okay? Did that merchandise belong to them?
No.
Did they think about what those people were losing? Did they even think about the hurt that those people were going to suffer?
They thought the people deserved it.
They thought they deserved it, perhaps. Okay. Now, or were they thinking at all? Maybe not. Now, I want us to realize it's pure satanic. God teaches us a very important lesson here in Exodus 20 and verse 15 when he says, "You shall not steal." He's teaching us something very fundamental when he says, "You shall not steal." He's not just saying, "Don't do it. Take my word from it. Don't do it." He wants you to think, why does he say that? God, Father knows best, just don't ask. Why? No, he wants you to ask why. Why not? Why not steal?
It's like other things, it just leads to something else.
There's a reason why it's not right to steal.
It's free and they don't have to pay for it.
It doesn't belong to you. You are responsible for that. Remember with the first murder, what was it that Cain said to God? Am I my brother's keeper? Am I responsible for my brother? You understand, these commandments that we're dealing with get down to the whole idea of loving your neighbor as yourself. The law of Moses teaches this principle that Jesus taught. It is called, Jesus calls it in Matthew 7:12. What do we call that verse? Whatsoever you would that man should do unto you, do you even so unto them. What is that? What do we call that law?
Golden rule.
The golden rule. Okay, what is the form of that law here in the book of Moses? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. What's it called? We call it something else. The royal law. Okay, it's the royal law. Same thing. Okay, just different words. The idea is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Whatever you would that men should do unto you, do you even so unto them. It's the same idea. Now, these laws of God in Exodus and in Leviticus are an interpretation of that law. God wanted them to learn to love their neighbor as themselves. God wanted them, here again, God wanted them to think like God thinks. How does God think?
Above us.
John 3:16. How does God think?
Motivated by love.
God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That's how God thinks. If we think like God, how do we think?
What's in the best interest of another?
That's it. We've got to learn to think like God thinks. And that's what God was teaching Israel right here. And you'll see it when he talks about loving the sojourner. He says, I want you to love the sojourner. Why? He gives them a reason. Because you were sojourners in Egypt. You treat the sojourner with mercy and respect. Everybody else, everywhere else, were xenophobic. What does xenophobic mean? We like that word, don't we? Xenophobic. That's a good Greek word. Xeno. Xeno. What
You're
is
focused
that?
too much on your own country,
Yeah.
not on others.
Yeah. A Greek would say, Xeno, that means foreigner. Foreigner. You're afraid of foreigners. No. We are taught by God and by the gospel to love the foreigner. God taught Israel to love the foreigner, to love them. Although in Jesus' day, did the Jews love the foreigners? Unfortunately, they did not get that lesson. They missed that lesson. And that's when the Great Commission from Jesus' lips, it was such a strange thing, I think, for the apostles to hear. And it took them a long time to really grasp what that meant. Yes?
I'm not sure exactly where you're going next, but there's a lot of places to go. But
I'm seeding us. Okay, I'm getting us started.
A great passage to throw aside
Okay.
right where you're at is Ephesians 4:28. Let him who stole steal no more.
That's at the end of my lesson. Go ahead.
Do you want me to say that?
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I like to start at the end.
It's a great connection with where you're at.
Yes, ma'am.
It shows the opposite of that. If you're going to repent from stealing, he says first stop stealing,
Yeah.
and then labor with your hands so that you may have something to share with anyone in need.
That's the whole point.
That's the beautiful full picture.
In order to learn to stop stealing, we've got to learn to start giving. That's the whole idea. In order to control the kleptomaniac, okay, to learn to break the habit, in many cultures, have you ever traveled in a country where all the houses have to have high walls with barbs on the walls and with broken glass and cement around? You ever seen those? You know,
That's where Gloria
gives
grew
me
up.
the creeps.
Yeah.
You know,
Gloria grew up in that kind of environment.
Because petty theft is the curse. You know, and there are communities actually where there's none of that. In these very same countries where they have a tribal policy that's so extreme, people are terrified of petty theft because it's punishable by death. They will kill petty thieves because they have had enough of it. And they do. And they all know it. But it is a terrible thing to live with thievery of that kind. And I've forgotten why I got onto this thing. But, okay, the whole idea is the motivation. How do you stop petty theft? You've got to learn to be generous. Learn to be giving. And so, Ephesians 4 and verse 28. Put off the old man of thievery. Put on the what?
Humanity.
Rather, labor with your hands so that you may give to him who has need. There's the idea. Put off and put on the new man. Now, I wanted to, along that line, take us to one of Jesus' favorite key passages, Hosea 6 and verse 6. He quoted it twice as a major criticism of the Pharisees of his day. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. He told the Pharisees to go and study their Bible and learn what this verse meant. And they loved to hear him say this. One of their favorite rebukes. For I desire steadfast love. The word there is mercy. It's chesed. But I love this translation of it. Because the word mercy in Hebrew is a great big word. That's why it's translated here as steadfast love. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Notice in verse 4, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud. Your love, okay? Like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I've slain them by the words of my mouth. My judgment goes forth as the light. I desire mercy or steadfast love and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant, and there they dealt faithlessly with me. You see, in that context, Hosea is with great passion showing the feelings of God toward them. And right in the middle of it, the great failure that they had was the lack of this tender, steadfast love and mercy and kindness that God tried to teach them. The knowledge of God. But they were very faithful in their sacrifices. But to what? To what end? And then the other one, Micah 6:8. Yes.
Before you leave that passage, down in verse 9 of Hosea 6, you can see these things connected that you were connected earlier.
Good, good.
Robbers lie in wait, priests band together, they murder on the way to Shechem, they commit villainy. In the house of Israel, I've seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there, Israel is defied. So he's connecting a lot of these principles with our interactions to one another. That's right.
Thank you. Yeah. That's good. That's good. Yes, it all is all a part. You know, the morality is all tied together. All of these issues are all tied together because of the attitude of the heart. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. Yes, Lucy?
Does stealing apply to our business transactions with others? Ideals are...
Yes.
Let's say I have a business, or maybe I have I sell something and I sell it for more.
Yes, right.
We have to be people of integrity, right?
We have to have integrity in all of our business.
Taking advantage, maybe taking advantage, being covetous.
I'm going to go over all that if I know I won't have time, but I thank you for bringing that up.
And also about instead of working like we're commanded to work, we live off the government,
That's right. That's exactly right. We've got to put these into practice in every aspect of our life and our business. Micah 6 and 8, He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Beautiful, beautiful verse. That's what the Lord wants us to do. Okay, let me just go over quickly in Exodus 21, the next chapter of Exodus. And there won't be a need for a lot of discussion of this, but in verse 16, to steal a human being, kidnapping of a human being and making him a slave. It's often said that the Bible was a cause and source of human slavery. But under the law of Moses, if you were to steal a human being and make him a slave, what was the penalty? Death. How about that? Did the Bible endorse the stealing of people to make them a slave? No. Punishable by death. Exodus 21 verse 1. To steal an ox, if the ox is killed or sold, you have to replace the ox with 5 oxen. How about that? If you were to steal a sheep and it was killed or sold, then you must replace it with 4 sheep. In verse 2, if the thief is killed while he's breaking into your house, then there is no blood guilt. Think about that. If the thief is caught during the day, you may not kill him. Sorry about that. You've got to just... but he does have to repay what he had stolen, double, verse 4, if he still has it. And if he can't repay, he may be sold into slavery, but now not slavery like for life. The Jews were only sold for slavery for 7 years, and then released in Jubilee. Exodus 22 and verse 5. If one allowed his stock to graze in the field of his neighbor, he had to make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. That will be a theft by neglect, okay? You can be guilty of stealing from somebody if you neglect, okay? You allow your livestock to go into your neighbor's field, and then your neighbor suffers loss because of your neglect. That's theft. Exodus 22 and 25. Oh, no, I'm sorry, verse 7 through 15. You have a whole section here about you have something that was given to you in trust, okay? Something is loaned to you, or you accept something that was given to you by your neighbor, your friend, who trusts you, okay? And so your neighbor comes back to you and say, I'm sorry I lost it. Or somebody stole it, but you're lying about it. What are you doing? You stole it. Okay? That's theft. If you swear falsely, you must make restitution. That's called fraud. That's another way. You can use fraudulent means in order to steal. There's all kinds of fraudulent ways that people steal one from another. Okay? Yeah. I'm not going to go into all of that. It's way over my head. But let me take you to Leviticus chapter 6 right quick and give you some more examples. In the religious context, Exodus 21 is civil law, and the civil penalties for dealing with that, and I am no lawyer. Leviticus 6 is more of a context of a breach of faith against Jehovah. Verses 1 through 7, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, if anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, or has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely in any of all the things that people do and sin thereby. This is dealing with swearing by Jehovah. The concern here is more a matter of you've called Jehovah or the Lord as witness. And so the primary concern of Leviticus 6 is you've not just stolen from your neighbor, but you've called God as witness. And so it is a breach of faith before Jehovah. But he's given us examples of ways in which we can steal and defraud. A matter of deposit, a matter of security, a matter of robbery, a matter of oppression, whatever that might be. I think we know what oppression is, or a matter of something lost, okay? Have you ever found something that somebody you know lost? You found it, okay? Somebody lost their billfold out in the parking lot. It's got their name in it. It's got their money in it. It's got their credit cards. What do you do about that?
Call the police.
Call the police, turn it in, take it to the store office, or
Contact the person if you know them.
okay, or call the person if you know.
Society will tell you losers weepers. Finders
Finders keepers, losers weepers. Do you have an obligation? Yes, you do. According to this, you have an obligation before God. You have an obligation to them. They lost it, but you know about it. So yes, you do have an obligation to them. You have, why? Because they're your neighbor. And you should love your neighbor as yourself. Let's go ahead to that chapter in chapter 19 of Leviticus, which deals more specifically with that. Our time is running out real quick. We talked about it already. I'd like you just to notice the way that Leviticus 19 leads up to that verse 18. Beginning in verse 9, he just gives a number of examples of ways in which we need to be kind to our neighbor. In verse 9, he talks about being kind and merciful to the poor. And then verse 11, don't steal or deal falsely with one another. And then verse 12, don't swear falsely in Jehovah's name. Then verse 13, don't oppress your neighbor or rob your hired servant of his wages. You know, he worked for you all day. Pay him on time. Don't make him suffer. Verse 14, don't be cruel to a man who's deaf or blind. Yeah, you know, there's people who entertain themselves cursing a deaf man. That's funny, isn't it? You can curse a man who's deaf and he doesn't hear you. Isn't that funny? You're saying all kinds of vulgar and dirty things to this deaf man and he has no idea you're saying it. That's hilarious, isn't it? It's not. Everybody is laughing about it. And he doesn't know what you're saying unless he can read your lips. What about a blind man? You know, you got all your buddies there, and you put a stone out there for him to trip over, and he trips and he falls on his face. That is hilarious. Is it funny? No, it's not. It's not funny. Who is it funny to? Somebody who has a sick sense of humor, who does not care about his fellow man. Someone who does not love his neighbor as himself. Now, that's the whole point of this. Now, there are cruel people in this world who never have learned, who haven't stopped to think, what if that were me? Could it be? It could be. Could I lose my eyesight?
Yeah.
Could I lose my hearing? I could. Would I want that to happen to me? Whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do ye even so unto them. See?
A couple of thoughts, Terry. There was a story in the news, I think it came out 2 days ago. It was a video from New York where a car looked very intentionally swerved and hit a man. Looked like it was on purpose.
Yeah.
And a crew of them got out and robbed the man rather than rendering him any kind of aid.
Yeah.
And then ran back in the car, and they drove just a little ways and stopped. And one of them got out and went back and robbed him again. But I guess they saw something and went back and got it again. But to me, it illustrates kind of where you started. Is you don't steal unless you have a complete disregard for the other person. And it made me think about the Good Samaritan, which I think is another great illustration of opposites.
Yeah.
You have on the one hand, you had people who beat him up and took whatever he had, and then you have another group of people who did nothing to help, and then you have another man who is willing to give everything he possibly could. He, even to the point of putting him on his own, mount,
Right.
and sacrificing and committing more help. It's the complete opposite of the stealing.
Now, the reason why we have people that are cruel like that is because of injustice that there is in the world. And that's what we have in this next statement, where it says in verse 16, where am I? Let's see. I lost my place. It says, Okay, in verse 17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. Now think about that, what he's implying. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. Now, why would you have the word vengeance here? What does that imply? You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly. Why would you need to reason frankly with someone? Why would you be tempted to hate someone? Why would you need to reason frankly with them?
Perceive you're wrong.
That's it. And so he's done you wrong. You're persuaded that he has wronged you. And it's just like what Jesus says. What should you, if your brother has wronged you, what should you do?
Go and talk to him about it.
Talk to him about it. Reason with him frankly. That's what Jesus said. Lest you incur sin. You become the sinner. Okay? Why? Because now you want to take vengeance and you bear a grudge wrongfully. You may be wrong about him. You may be bearing a grudge against the sons of your own people. That's very possible. Now, what did Jesus teach about grudges? What about in Matthew 5, okay, here again, about someone who provokes you. Matthew 5, about someone provokes you, maybe striking you on the right cheek. Okay. What's he trying to do? Is he trying to kill you?
Yeah.
You think, if you were to try to kill somebody, would you strike them on the right cheek?
I think I might do something a little more drastic.
I would think maybe you're trying, you'd aim somewhere else, maybe. I suppose you could kill somebody if you hit them hard enough on the right cheek, but I don't think that's probably what you're aiming at. Usually, you do that as an insult. Okay, you're trying to make them mad. You're trying to insult them. And that's the whole idea, to provoke. And you are provoked, unjustly, okay, insulted. Okay? Jesus said, allow them to insult you. And then he said, if he compels you to go a mile,
Go to.
go another one. Go another mile. Okay? What about your enemies? Love your enemies. Okay? But what if they really are bad people? I mean, they really are enemies. I mean, they're really bad enemies. I mean, that's why they're enemies. They really are bad. They're my enemies because I'm good. Keep that in mind now, okay? They're my enemies because I'm good and they're bad. Let's keep that in context, okay? That's why they're my enemies, because they're bad and I'm good. So I should love them anyway?
Yes.
Okay. And so, how is it that I'm to love them? In what way? What did Jesus say? He said, pray for them. What else? Do good to them. Do good for them even though they do bad to you. Now, the next thing in Luke 19, he says, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the last thing he says is what? I am Jehovah. Now, we've run across that statement several times already. In Exodus, you remember the effect that has whenever the Lord is trying to really stamp his foot You know, we used to have preachers that would do that. I don't know. When they're preaching and they're really coming to a strong point, they would raise their voice, they would pound the pulpit, and they would stamp their foot. And God says, I'm Jehovah. Okay? He is saying, I am who I am. Don't forget that. He's saying, I mean it. Don't test me on this. Don't challenge me on this. I really mean it. This is very, very serious. Very, very important. I don't know how God can make it more serious than that. The whole idea, the more I read my Bible and the more I read the New Testament, and I've told you in our studies of the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, and we've talked about how the message of Jesus is a message of the life that's in the Father. That the life that's in the Father is the light of the world. The life is the character of God. It's the way that God thinks and the way that God lives, and it's the message of God that was preached by John and preached by the Son of God, Jesus Christ. It's that message, it's that character of God that He insists that we hear and that we obey. It's that message. It's this message that we're talking about. It's a message of putting into practice the principles of the love of God, the love of neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Even to this degree. The Bible is full of this. And when He comes to a point like this series, and He says, I am Jehovah. This is being underlined. He put a circle around it, and He put exclamation points, and He wants us to be sure and not miss it. Have we got it? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.